Hello, everyone. Welcome to TRT World Forum Digital Debate Series titled Designing the Future of Planet Earth Towards the Green Transition, which includes a series of live discussions on the trending issues of climate change and energy transition. My name is Samet Shahin. I'm a researcher at TRT World Forum, and today we will have the seventh session of our debate series. Today we will talk about a really interesting topic, which will be about transformation of a giant, namely China's energy transition. And we will talk about its implications for the future and for our world. Joining me today, we have Shalu Zhou. She is the director of global climate change at China program of Environmental Defense Fund. Welcome, Lulu.
Thank you.
And Dr. Michal Maidan. She is the director of China Energy Program and also the director of Gas Research Program at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Welcome, Michal.
Thank you.
Let me give you a brief introduction about our session, then I'll kick off the session by asking the first question. China is the largest energy consumer in the world. Prior to the COP26, the Chinese government has revealed that its commitment to green transition is growing incrementally, and the Belt and Road Initiative gained momentum in terms of low carbon energy investments. China aims to improve energy security by diversifying the energy sources, investing in renewable energy, and enhancing collaborations in many countries. And it has announced that it will pull the overseas coal financing, which was welcomed by the rest of the world. However, the fact that China is still responsible for more than half of the world's coal consumption raises the question of how will the Chinese government manage the energy transition and achieve net zero in 2060 as it pledged. In this session, the present and future impacts of China's climate action on the global energy outlook will be discussed. Lulu, I want to start the discussion with you. What what are the main challenges and opportunities for China's green transition?
Thank you. Thank you for the question to start. It's a really broad and um, good one. So the challenge actually, we can see more and more challenge right now, like the economic crisis due to COVID, the energy crisis from everywhere. So fossil fuel actually coming back to the center of public and private sector conversation once again. And the policymaker are clearly stated that clean and efficient coal usage as a short-term solution. So with the COVID slow down the economic growth, the whole society is more sensitive to the cost than before. So because discussions like ensure power sector or power supply security and stability and increase the cost of power storage with higher level of renewables in the power grid mix is also a challenge that we have to face right now. And also other main challenges like the bottleneck of clean energy technology development, including like hydrogen, large-scale renewable storage. We cannot pretending that we solve all of the problem right now, as IEA estimated. Majority of technology that we need to achieve carbon neutrality is not ready right now. And furthermore, how to achieve just transition is one of the really important challenges we have to face moving toward this green economy or green energy system, particularly given the high dependency of energy supply on coal and fossil fuel uses, especially some of these provinces in China that are center of coal production are also not that well developed like what you see in the eastern coast of China, like Shanghai or Shenzhen. So how to ensure the just transition didn't really harm the locals' well-being and provide them with fair opportunity is really crucial to overcome and consider. But we might also gain a lot along those challenges, like in 2021 last year, the low carbon renewable electricity capacity increased by 13% and 17% respectively. And the employment in China's renewable sector has counted for 40% of renewable energy employment worldwide since 2012, reaching about 4.7 million in 2020. So a lot of the green jobs counted and already exceeding the employment in the fossil fuel extraction industry by more than 1.5 million. So energy security concern is also buttressed. It's also like giving China's more determination on renewable energy development. Like renewable energy total consumption target for China in 2025 is up to 1 billion tons of standard coal consumption equivalent, which is estimated to 2.6 billion tons of CO2 reduction. So only to reduce the consumption of fossil fuel like oil and gas can reduce the dependency on energy import and supply security. Because China is really lack of oil and gas, although it has abundance, not really abundance, but it has more coal. So finally, we can see more and more people realizing that energy security and low carbon development are equally important. So China's national carbon market is also an effective tool that we might see it's come to more effectiveness and regulate and control the emission of potential. Because when we came to this cost-sensitive era, more cost efficiency policy like carbon pricing will become more and more important, and people consider to use them. So I think that's the main challenge and opportunities I see.
Thank you so much for the answer, Lulu. Like I knew that this was the hardest question, but I have the same for you, Michael. I just wanted to know what's your take on this? Like what can we what like what we have against China's green transition? What are the challenges and also the opportunities?
I mean, I think Xiaolu did a great job in identifying a huge amount of both challenges and opportunities. If I take a step back and start with the opportunities, then certainly from sort of an economic or industrial point of view, then there are huge opportunities in building up non-fossil fuel industries, the supply chains associated with it. And this is, of course, something that China's already doing and is leading in renewables manufacturing, in batteries and battery supply chains. I would say also in new technologies, not just on the supply side, on sort of greening our supplies, but also on the demand side of managing demand more efficiently, of reducing overall demand. In terms of, and when we look at it sort of from an emissions point of view, obviously there are huge opportunities associated with that deployment of non-fossil fuels to reduce the carbon footprint, improve health within China, as there are obviously lots of premature deaths and health situations that incur a cost for the economy, right? If we bring it down to practical terms, the impact of extreme weather events, all of those are not just a burden on the government's fiscal coffers, but of course an issue for social and for public opinion. So obviously these are huge opportunities. The challenge is, it's simple to describe, but again, Xiaolu unpacked lots of it. The challenge is how to sequence and phase out fossil fuels. Because this is an economy that is still growing. We have to remember, I think, especially when we sit in the West and in Europe, and energy demand has essentially peaked. In China and in many emerging and developing countries, there is still a huge amount of economic growth that needs to happen to fuel urbanization, to fuel industrialization processes. And doing that while also ensuring secure and affordable supplies is, I think, the biggest challenge that China faces currently.
You're mute.
I'm so sorry. Okay, I'm starting again. Thank you for the answer, Michael. I think that was a great summary. Lulu, It's been around 2 years since President Jinping announced the carbon neutrality goal for 2060. However, it's always easier said than done. What has changed since then in terms of governance of decarbonization in China? How effectively does China follow its decarbonization path?
Mm, that's actually a very interesting question. So a lot of action actually has been put in effect since this carbon peaking and neutrality goal, or we call it dual carbon goal, has been proposed. For example, a lot of local government has committed their own carbon peaking goals in their next 5-year plan, because China right now is in the formulation of the next round of 5-year plan. And also China has established this, they called One Plus N policy framework to achieving carbon peaking and neutrality. Is being developed right now. More and more policies from top down are released to pave the way toward 2060 goal. And also a lot of the SOEs and huge large scale enterprises are releasing their own pathway or strategy or whatever they called, on their determination or their pathway towards or to help them achieve carbon neutrality. So green transition in power sector is very significant, I think, because I want to mention, because power sector basically representing more than 40% of China's total emission. It's around 4.5 billion tons of CO2 per year. So till the end of 2021, China's total installed capacity of non-fossil fuel generation increased by 13.5 compared with previous year. And the generation from non-fossil fuel sources in 2021 increased by 12.1 in 1 year, and the reform of power market is also undergoing very smoothly. 45%, actually it's 45.5% of total electricity are transacted through the market. Basically, it's a 3.3 improvement compared with the year of 2020, because China's electricity was not that free before. So with a more free electricity market, it can help us, or can help the market, to pass the cost of carbon from the producer or the electricity generator to the end user, to give the market or the society a better tool to facilitate the green transition. And furthermore, I think the more public investment will be introduced in the more or to the new energy field and incentivize the development of carbon-free technology like hydrogen and CCUS or CCS. But most importantly, the research of carbon neutrality has been greatly enhanced after the announce. So, like a lot of the SOEs are asked to spend more money, like a higher percentage of their profit into the R&D of certain type of development of technology. And also, China is speeding up its climate financing too, such as the central bank announced. Actually, it's already launched the low carbon development tool, which basically provides very low cost or low interest money to finance the climate friendly project around China. That various transaction or industry transition financing project has also been launched, like just between last year, between February and June. There are already 44 companies has issued 55, they called carbon neutrality bond, account around 62.9 billion of RMB. So that's huge amount of money. Although we cannot say that all it's 100% no greenwashing, but it's actually the bright side is people from finance, both financing, political area and the industry area, realize this is a great opportunity.
Yeah, this is a really multifaceted issue. So like these ambitions have to be coupled with some real willingness to be realized. Mikhail, what's your take on this? How has China been performing in terms of decarbonization policies after the announcement of net zero goal?
I think it's important to bear in mind that the announcement of the net zero goal was the beginning of a process, not the culmination of one. right? So when Xi Jinping announced the 30-60 targets, the dual carbon targets, there was no ready sort of blueprint that had been devised within the Chinese bureaucracy. And what we are seeing now is a process. And it is very similar to many other countries. I think, very few countries know how they're going to get there. They know where we need to get and they know where they want to get. But, the IEA has lovely charts about this kind of linear trajectory towards net zero. The reality is that it is going to be bumpy and complicated. We don't know the costs of many technologies. We don't know the availabilities. And so there's a lot of trial and error that we're seeing globally, but also in China. So I think since what has happened is a very clear signal that the direction of travel is changing, right? What is now commonly assumed, that in 2060, China will have 80% non-fossil fuels in the energy mix. 3 years ago, that was some of the, China Renewable Energy Association, some of their forecasts, those were seen as pipe dreams. Now it has become very much part of the consensus and the mainstream view. I think there's been a lot of political setup behind it, bureaucracies and administrative bodies that are set up in order to try and coordinate this kind of march to net zero. I think that's hugely significant. Even though the kind of direction of travel is clear, and as I said, how we get there is not clear, and implementation is a huge challenge, right? We've seen these discussions about whether provinces are going too fast or they're trying to do net zero in an unorderly way. All of that is still to be figured out. But again, I think that what has happened is a very clear sign that the direction of travel has changed. But we're seeing this elsewhere as well, that even though there are long-term ambitions, there are also short-term realities. And the short-term realities, especially in the past 2 years with COVID and now the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they are proving to be a huge distraction from the long-term ambitions. Now, I think the current crisis does offer an impetus and a motive for deeper change, but of course, governments need to create those opportunities and those signals. So far, we're seeing very mixed signals. We're seeing a very strong reliance on coal as part of the energy security debate. But what I find interesting and encouraging is that renewables are becoming part of the energy security debate in China as well. So I think it's a bit too early to, the jury is very much out on how effective China has been already in its net zero sort of trajectory. I think we can point, as we see in the press very frequently, you can point to huge progress, but you can also point to huge challenges. They go hand in hand. But so far, again, I think that the messaging has changed very profoundly, and that is very good news.
Thank you, Michal. I think Lulu just got dropped. Oh yeah, she is here. Yeah, can you hear us, Lulu?
Yes, clearly.
Oh, that's great. So I wanna keep up with Chinese government's transition efforts, and Michal just mentioned that the implementation is a serious thing. So being the largest in the world, China's national emission trading system, namely ETS, was officially launched last year, covering the power generation industry, and more industry coverage is yet to come. How has the Chinese power market performed in aligning with the ETS so far?
Actually, China started to. I want to go back a little bit with the history of Chinese carbon market. China started to think to have pilot carbon market was about 10 years ago in the year of 2011. So at that time, China started to build 7 pilot carbon market around different regions. With regions are really rich, eastern part of China, with regions are a very developed region with no heavy industry, and also with region that are with various developed, like less developed stage and need heavy industries. So in the year of 2005, China's president Xi Jinping together jointly released a statement with, at that time, the president of US Obama saying that China will build a national carbon market in the year of 2017. But at that time, it was kind of a crazy and unrealistic goal to build the largest carbon market in the world within 2 years. So what happened in the year of 2017 is China released a 3-step plan to build a national carbon market that's launched last year. So the first year carbon market actually covers 2,162 power companies only. That covers already more than 50% of China's total economy, carbon market, carbon emission. But all the 7 sectors, basically around more than 7,000 companies around all key industries have to report, or we call MRV, they have to report their annual emission data since the year of 2013. So carbon market's performance is not really depends on the companies that only covered by carbon market. Because China is very different, is that like what Michael shared, China start kind of relatively late. Majority of the carbon market in the world are built after the country has already peaked their emission, like we see in UK, in EU, in US. But China is facing the economic development together with the carbon constraint. And also China launches carbon market in 2021, but covers the emission from the year of 2019 to 2020, which is the COVID year. So when the government designing the carbon market, they don't really have that idea what the COVID will have influenced the power generation in the year of 2020. So for us, from our perspective, I think the first year right now, some formal document is the compliance rate for allowance surrenders is around 99.5. So the compliance rate is relatively high. And the average price is around $7. It's not that high. And the majority of the allocation are done for free. But it's actually more of the performance, or what we think is this achievement of China's carbon market is the put idea of that you need to pay for emitting carbon into all of the enterprises idea, not only power sector, but majority power sector. They have job to monitor their emission, to formulate strategies, and all of the majority of the the power generation companies are large scale enterprises. So they build internal carbon reporting system. They build their own strategy. They build their own trading desk. So right now, this thing is this carbon emissions data from all of the different power plant units comes to the central decision makers, like the top leader of this large scale power companies of China. So I think this is significant. And also when they're making future investment, they have to think about the price of carbon in the future. Because price is not that high right now in $7, but it will go high. People are looking at the EU pricing right now, it's more than 80 euros per ton. And they're asking like how soon China will achieve that level. So it's good or bad, but more of the good perspective. So I think from that perspective, it's do a lot of good for China's power sectors reform or greener their generation in the future.
Many thanks, Lulu. I'll open this up a bit more in the next turn. Mika, as you mentioned, like implementation, I just want to focus on this. I want to touch upon the fact that the clean energy transition in China is a state-led process. What are the pros and cons of this? How does political and institutional setting in China affect the transition process?
That's a great question. And I think one that many governments around the world are grappling with, right? We need to get somewhere, unlike previous sort of energy revolutions that have been driven by technologies and the availability of new technologies or new supplies. What we really need to do now is shrink our energy consumption while also making it greener. And so the exercise is very different. And there are lots of different views about how we get there, about the role of the state and the role of the markets. Should it be through pricing signals that, as Xiaolu was just talking about the ETS, about incorporating the cost of externalities and carbon emissions and making consumers, polluters pay for those externalities. But since, and then, and to what extent will markets be the ones to determine which technologies win, so to speak, which are the best performing technologies? The flip side of that is that we don't really have time, or we have limited time for trial and error. And so there is room for governments to send very clear signals. I think often when we look at China, we tend to think China is a centralized government. It's, and therefore it has the ability to drive change very effectively. Or on the other side of the spectrum is this view, especially in the West, that China is not a democracy, it is not a liberal economy, and therefore it will not do things efficiently, and cannot, again, make efficient changes. And I think the reality is probably a combination of both. Sort of China's centralized economy and governance structure, especially under Xi Jinping, there has been greater centralization of power, has the ability to mobilize resources and to send strong signals in a direction that will then lead to changes in the way capital is allocated, in the way investment decisions are made. But that is only a signal, and it only goes so far. So I think we cannot assume that because China says, then it will be done. And we talked a little bit about implementation challenges, about how provinces have different mandates and different needs. This is the just transition, but it is also different opportunities, different resource endowments, and again, sort of different priorities that they need to meet. So corporates have, right? If we think about it very simplistically, that the energy transition means that coal and fossil fuels need to lose. These are all state-owned industries in China, and the state cannot lose. So we have to think, I think, a little bit differently about the energy transition in China. This has to be an adaptation that happens throughout the system. The centralized government can, as I said, send strong signals. It can lead the direction of travel. It can also make investments that aren't necessarily the most cost effective, but will lead to outcomes, right? Maybe not economically efficient outcomes, but very effective outcomes. On the other hand, the fact that China is siloed, the institutions and sectors are quite siloed and have trouble, I think, collaborating, that demand side management is an issue, that sort of, public participation in the grid, that power price reform is happening, but it is very slow. All these things that will need to happen for the energy transition, again, like end users being to send to sell electricity back to the grid, or the fact that sectors need to come together. The energy transition is a system-wide approach. In China's sort of siloed institutions, those are challenges and barriers that I think will be difficult to overcome, that you have incumbents that need to lead very disruptive change. Now, I don't think it means China cannot accomplish its energy transition. Again, I think there are areas where the governance and institutions will help China in delivering strong growth, sort of strong change. But there are areas where change will be slower. And so it's, I think, a little bit of an academic answer, but sort of, I think Chinese institutions both help and hinder the energy transition. And I think it would be wrong to view it in a very binary way of sort of China can do it or China cannot. And the same applies for other governments. It's all trial and error. Different governance systems have certain advantages and certain disadvantages when it comes to a rapid, I think, and cost-effective energy transition.
Michal, thank you for the answer. It was a great summary, actually. Lulu, welcoming, like I'll try to keep up with ETS issue, as you are the expert on this topic. Welcoming China's efforts, IEA, International Energy Agency, reports that enhancements in the scheme and energy policy mix would effectively help China achieve carbon neutrality in 2060. What's your take on the future of China's ETS? What are the main areas to be enhanced in the China's national ETS?
Okay. I want to start with the main area that need to be enhanced, because it's a relatively new market, although we say it's the largest in the world, but we know it's just a baby. And there's so many. Like, I want to start with auction, because right now basically all of the allocation are done for free. Although there's trading, but the trading is basically between different enterprises or different power companies that have different technology or different type of efficiency. So the auction actually is one of the really like successful experience we can see in EU, in California, in REGI, in all of the existing carbon market. We need to transit from free allocation to auction, and also the use of proceed is huge. And it could be supporting the transition finance. It could be supporting the just transition, pay for the cost of the operation of carbon market, or even to help the disadvantaged community, like what happened globally. But this is really something that's hard to achieve. For example, the MOF, the Ministry of Finance in China, publicly against the idea of setting up a separate funding for carbon market auction proceed because they think there are already enough subsidies, enough special fundings to support low carbon development, like renewable subsidies. So we need to help this coordination between different government ministries, or to help to build the capacity and understanding of different ministries to enhance the understanding, to let them know that this is not the same. Because before, carbon market or climate related policies really within a little world that don't communicate with a lot of people. But right now with the 2060, we have more opportunity to to ask them to hear about us, to hear what actually is going. And the second challenge is the data quality, because we all know that there's this data fraud issue just happening in the China ETS. But frankly speaking, I think we have this data fraud because China's government has more capacity to identify where are the wrong places. Because frankly speaking, I have to say, like, nobody really believed that for the past 10 years, 8 years, China's data quality is perfect. So it's a good start to know that where are the fraud. So only we know we are fraud, we can come to fix it, to let people understand this is serious. It's not just you count a number; it really comes with penalties. And the other one is coverage expansion, because China power sector is the only sector that covered. So the foundation philosophy, or the foundation idea of carbon market, is to incentivize the industry or the sector that have lower costs of carbon emission reduction, to add them to reduce more so they can sell in the market. And with the power sector, for example, they have higher cost of emission reduction, so they can buy cheaper credit in the market. So there's this kind of buy and sellers in the market. But carbon power sector in China are very unique. So they basically are kind of comparatively new. So the technology are relatively same. So there's no huge difference of emission reduction marginal cost in this sector. So we can now see that carbon market with only one sector can be very successful with free allocation. REG is successful because it's 100% auction. And also the weird part is China don't have a climate law. So right now, ETS measurement is the only ministry level law that control carbon emission for the sake of carbon emission. Although there was a lot of measure that control physical energy efficiency, but they are not for the sake of carbon. So we need to have a higher level of legislation to provide enforcement power, for example, to regulate not only carbon market, but also all of the other climate law, to support it, to give it tools. And also the reform of offset management, because CCER is the China Carbon Emission Reduction Project, the offset project. It stopped in the year of 2017 because of various reasons, and it need reform and kick up as soon as possible. And the other one is international linkage, and because right now Article 6 is the one of the important articles that left in the Paris Agreement, and it's related to international carbon market or carbon price and linkage. And a lot of other countries are asking China whether they can sell their offset into Chinese carbon market. So even if China's don't do it, it need to consider the possibility of it right now to make it into the legislation, to leave a room for that international linkage in the future. So I want to sum up with the future of carbon market, or the ETS, because ETS is never the cure for everything in all of the international policy mix of climate policy. Like EU, we are talking about a lot about the Fit for 55. Carbon market is only one or only part of the policy portfolio. So it need to be backed up with a lot of other policies. Like its ETS is relatively high maintenance in administrative perspective. It's suited for larger industries, like it's very efficient to sending a very clear pricing signal to the society, but it's not for all emission sources like buildings, mobile source, transportations. For some of the sectors, it's easier to use tax or performance standard, things like that. So just not, I hope people are not counting on ETS to solve everything. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, it was a great summary of a really wide topic. And I want to take from your last point the international linkage, actually. Michael, development of China ETS is followed closely by the international actors. And besides the competition in politics, economics, and technology, and so on, what are the future implications of the energy transition for China's transatlantic relations, particularly with the US and EU?
I think I would flip that question in the sense that I think China will pursue its energy transition. I have no doubt that China will strive for its 2030, 2060 targets. And I think that's the case not necessarily because of a climate awakening in China. I don't think there are any climate deniers in the Chinese leadership. You know, I think the understanding of the threats of climate have long been recognized, but in the past few years, with the increase of extreme weather events, and I think also with the industrial and economic opportunities that the energy transition presents, and also the risks, right? If Europe imposes a carbon border adjustment mechanism, then Chinese industry could lose out in terms of competitiveness. So there are very clear reasons why China should engage in its energy transition, not just for the sake of climate. For all those reasons, I think China will pursue its policies. The extent to which we, kind of the world, can get to net zero and carbon neutrality in a collaborative way, which, you know, if you think about some of the theories of economic globalization and the cost reductions associated with that, that would argue that we would make it faster and cheaper for everyone. But geopolitics will determine whether we do that collaboratively or whether we do it in regional or national level blocks. I mean, what we are seeing today in terms of the discourse and the very fraught international relations, this sense of decoupling and tensions between China and the West, suggests that as both China and Western countries pursue their various energy transitions with their different targets and timelines, it will be a competition that is not necessarily conducive to the global energy transition. My point is that, you know, with relocating or reshoring industries and supply chains into different countries, yes, we create new supplies of everything, but not necessarily in the most efficient and cost-effective way, right? When we think about renewables, historically, there was a lot of input from Western companies in terms of design and technology into China. China's huge input was in scaling those up quickly and bringing to cost reductions that then helped the energy transit, that then helped renewables, but also batteries and battery technologies globally become cheaper and more widespread. In order to be able to replicate that with hydrogen, with CCUS, with other technologies, there needs to be coordination, there needs to be collaboration. But again, I don't think that geopolitical tensions will stop that. They will just make the energy transition slower and more complicated.
Thank you, Michal. Thank you for the answer. I'll continue with geopolitics and international relations. Lulu, the insecurity in energy supplies after Russia's invasion of Ukraine has hit global energy transition efforts as the governments had to revise their energy policies in favor of their energy security concerns, maybe rather than energy transition, roughly speaking. China may be one of them. How would you interpret the outcomes of the Russia-Ukraine war on China's progress in energy transition?
I think that question actually is a little bit similar to the previous challenge one because we all think the energy security became more and more familiar by the people who are not in the climate energy world. So people are hearing the world. People are hearing energy security is one of the top priority in EU, and a lot of people are thinking it's the top priority in China as well. China's power price is not 100% determined by the market as we previously discussed. So we didn't really see the spike of electricity price like what EU is experiencing right now. But people are not. It's not a world that people have friends in EU and people listen to the news. So the people are actually feeling the threatening of this insecurity. And especially China is a country that with abundance of coal, but very lack of oil and gas. So this type of security issue became more and more important and mentioned by more and more government document as well. So so it's like previously mentioned, energy security concern can accelerate the energy sector's green transition and reduce oil and gas import from the overseas area, but is also on the downside, kind of incentivize the coal to stay longer, like what we can see in a lot of the European country. However, I think there's a difference between the coal generation and coal installed capacity. I think a lot of people are so scared of China building more coal power generation, but actually the total installed capacity increase doesn't mean they are still baseload. So they're like providing flexibility into the grid or stability into the grid. And although like of course we can say that install capacity is kind of also show that you are using coal, but I think it's inevitable, like if we don't find a solution or technology disruption type of technology of the grid, there's a limitation of the renewable right now that we cannot overcome. So of course we have this goal of carbon neutrality, but we have to face with the current development, like what Michal mentioned, because China just has to. A lot of the part of China is still kind of very low development phase, and a lot of rural area that need connection of electricity. So the grid stability is part of the well-being or just transaction perspective of China's development. Um, and with saying that, I think also the coal market is one of the reform perspective because right now the coal pricing is kind of marketized that government don't really have to control, but the power market is have control. So which cause one problem is when the coal price is going up, the power generation or the coal consumption, the coal or the thermal plant are losing money by generation. So that's need a lot of systematic change to ensure that the just transition or the green transition in the Chinese market will be successful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lulu. Michael, rather than the tightened market prices following Ukraine's invasion, in your recent article, you argue that the zero COVID policy of the Chinese government would be a more effective reason for the low demand for oil and gas supply in China. What does this mean for the global energy supply dynamics?
I mean, I think what we tried to argue, it's very, and I think if you very simplistically, you can argue that for oil and gas, and certainly for gas, the Chinese market is more policy sensitive than it is price sensitive. If the demand is there, and we saw it with coal to gas switching, if the demand is there, then buyers will buy even at high prices. Obviously, within certain limits, and industrial users are susceptible to higher prices, but if there is a need for that resource and for those energy supplies, then somebody will pay for them. They might be subsidized later on, but they will be paid for. And the point that we were making in this article is that really what we've seen in terms of the weakness of oil and gas buying has very much been related to the weak economic activity in China. That's actually been great news for global markets because global gas markets have been very tight, with Europe pulling pretty much every sort of all available LNG. on its attempts to move away from Russian gas. Now, if China was in the market and other Asian buyers, if they were in the market buying LNG, then the competition for LNG would only increase and intensify, and prices would increase even further from their record highs. The oil market dynamic is slightly different, but again, when we are losing supplies and demand is gradually recovering, the fact that China is not buying as much as it would sort of in a typical year, or in a not necessarily even in a strong year, but as I say, in a typical year, that has actually offered some breathing space for markets, again, as we lose some Russian supplies. So I think, that there are these issues of sanctions and the unintended consequences of sanctions, because by losing mainly Russian gas, and the lack of availability of gas globally, it does mean that a lot of emerging Asian countries have to rely on coal. It sort of goes back to what Xiaolu was just saying. Higher prices, in theory, will incentivize more renewables if they are available, if lead times are there. But for now, it does mean a return to coal and other fossil fuels. So for global markets, I think the question is, what happens when the Chinese economy starts to pick up? And that will depend on when the zero COVID policy is loosened and when it becomes sort of more dynamic and less lockdowns. That there is sort of a desire, we're hearing from the government, a desire to kind of stimulate economic activity and recover. And when that happens, I think the Chinese buyers will need to go back into the markets and look for supplies of both oil and gas. Now, China is buying discounted Russian oil, some coal. There's not so much LNG, discounted LNG, that China can buy, because the EU has not banned imports of LNG. But when demand is there and China continues to buy, then the markets will tighten even further.
Thank you, Mikhail. I'd recommend Mikhail's article for everyone, by the way. It was really interesting. Here's the last turn of questions. Lulu, considering its scope, China's ETS will remain the largest carbon market in the world, and it will definitely play a key role in global decarbonization efforts, as we already mentioned. However, it fundamentally differs from the other carbon markets. How does China's ETS interact with the other carbon markets? Is it possible to align with the rest of the world?
Mm-hmm. I think it actually depends on the goal of a line, because our goal is to achieve more emission reduction at lower cost. So in theory, there's a lot of modern research saying that if we have a full linked international carbon market, we can achieve double amount of emission reduction with the same cost, or half of the cost with the same emission reduction. But there's various form of international linkage. Full linkage is going to be difficult because of a lot of, like what you mentioned, the design features are different, but some of the design features can be improved because it's just very early stage. But some of the design features are very Chinese characteristic that don't need to be changed. For example, both Chinese carbon market and Korea market has both indirect emission and direct emission into the market. It never happened in EU or California because they're totally free power market. But in both Korea and China, the pricing of electricity is not that free, so you don't have a mechanism that pass out the carbon cost from the generator to end user. That's why we need to include both direct and indirect. Of course, it comes with a problem with, for example, double counting, but the benefit is more. So that type of characteristic is something we don't need to change, but there's a lot that we can improve. Like while China was building its carbon market, it's learned a lot from EU ETS, from California carbon market, from RGGI. They know what is good. So it's very clear in the top policymakers' mind, as well as the key researchers who supporting design of ETS, that, for example, absolute cap is very important and it's the core. It don't have absolute cap. Basically, it's because right now, it's the COVID makes it so uncertain that if we over allocate, it's very difficult to get allowance back. So it's more of a security issue or security measure for the ETS to be secure, because the carbon intensity is more it's people like it's more stable than the absolute emission reduction or absolute carbon emission from the sector. Um, and also, I think one thing need to mention is the stability and the policy stability. Because, for example, in EU, in a lot of international carbon market, we see like EU has phase 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's already more than 10 years. So although EU has found something is wrong, it will stick with the idea until the next phase comes. But Chinese government or Chinese policy, like what Michal shared, is very policy sensitive. So the government is very sensitive with any of the criticism. So when they found something wrong, they want to change the glitch right away. It's kind of good, but it actually make the market very hard to adjust. You have to keep, although it's wrong, but you have to keep it stable for several years for the industry to make long-term decision. So right now, the Chinese government is trying to fix the carbon market all year long, which means they're so tired, they're exhausted themselves, and the market design is not stable. I think that's part of the government mindset issue that maybe we cannot train them. But in the future, I hope that the experience of put ETS into phase 1, 2, 3 can get into their mind so that they can learn from the US or EU experience more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lulu. I want to wrap up the discussion with the last question, which is about the future scenarios of China's energy transition. Mikhail, China is the largest carbon market in the world, and its transition will inherently determine the future of global decarbonization efforts. We know that China heavily invests in renewables, also make large investments in Belt and Road Initiative in different countries as well. So, what possible scenarios shall we expect regarding the role of China in the future of the planet? Can China be a climate champion despite being today's largest emitter?
I think it can and will be both, right? It is already a climate champion in terms of its role in renewable additions domestically, in its contribution to renewable manufacturing and electric vehicle manufacturing. I think the issue is always going to be one of perceptions. Even at COP27, right, China issued its nationally determined contributions sort of 1 year earlier. And those were very ambitious contributions to reach net zero by 2060. But obviously, there was an expectation for the NDC to be even more ambitious ahead of COP26, ahead of Glasgow, even though it was an issue of timing. So there's a whole issue of sort of expectations, and to a certain degree with the fraught geopolitical relations now, it's going to be very hard for China to win, so to speak, or to get good public relations, at least in the West. I do think that, as I said, China's commitment to net zero is real and is serious and will continue to happen. And just like, at COP26, there was so much talk about Xi Jinping not being there. I honestly don't think it would have mattered that, the country had a certain number of commitments that it was willing to undertake. Xi Jinping being there would not have changed that. We wouldn't have had a Copenhagen type scenario where all the leaders get together in a room, pull up their sleeves and hash out a new agreement. That just would not have happened. But on the other hand, when there was a US-China agreement that I honestly think did not say much new, these were sort of two pledges, it was China and the US reiterating a number of pledges. It was a promise to work together. Unfortunately, we haven't really seen those mechanisms come to life yet. But really, there was not much in that joint declaration, and yet it was heralded as a turning point for COP26. So again, I think a lot is about perceptions and sort of marketing. I think, again, in reality, China will do a lot for the energy transition, both domestically, as it develops more technologies and more capabilities, as China has done in so many other sectors. There is likely to be excess capacity, but that excess capacity is good in the sense that it spills over internationally and leads to cost reductions. On coal, I think we do need to be careful, and I think there has to be ongoing discussion and conversation, because I think there is a huge risk of using coal as flexible capacity, because it does give an impetus to add new coal-fired capacity. and it is less efficient in terms of emissions than renewables or gas. This is where the trade-off between stability and security comes in, and where some of China's institutional constraints hinder a more efficient market. So I think we do have to be careful about coal and about sort of how much coal and emissions China adds in the next few years. But overall, I do think that China will make huge gains, but it will be up to geopolitics how those gains are portrayed and to what extent the world can actually capitalize on them collectively, or whether we will fall into geopolitical traps of decoupling, or call it what you will, of a world that does not collaborate and therefore looks to outdo one another. That also could be a great thing for the energy transition if everybody tries to accelerate their own transition and be greener than the other. That would be great, but I'm not sure it would work that way.
Thank you so much, Michal. It was, well, this is the end of the session. I enjoyed a lot. I learned a lot. I hope our audience thinks the same. So, well, thank you for accepting my invitation again, and hopefully see you soon again. Bye.
Thank you.